People like her should be grateful they're allowed to serve us." Ethan Caldwell didn't bother lowering his voice when he spoke in Russian, the corners of his mouth lifting with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his entire life believing expensive suits, private jets, and foreign languages could buy immunity from consequences. The words drifted across the polished dining room of the Marlowe House, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, blending with the soft notes of a jazz trio, the delicate clink of crystal glasses, and the warm glow reflecting off towering wine displays that stretched almost 20 feet toward the ceiling. Around him, hedge fund executives, celebrity attorneys, and international investors smiled politely without fully understanding what had just been said. A few recognized the language. Fewer understood its meaning. None of them noticed the young black waitress standing only a few feet away, carefully pouring sparkling water into a crystal glass with hands so steady they never disturbed a single bubble. Naomi Brooks wore the same tailored black uniform as every other server in the restaurant, but nothing about her presence invited attention. She moved with practiced precision, replacing silverware before anyone realized it was missing, anticipating requests before they were spoken, disappearing into the rhythm of flawless service the way exceptional hospitality often does. To most guests, she was simply part of the background, another quiet figure making luxury feel effortless. Ethan certainly saw her that way. At 39, he had built Caldwell Capital into one of the fastest-growing investment firms in America. Financial magazines called him brilliant. Business podcasts praised his instincts. His interviews attracted millions of views because he spoke about discipline, confidence, and winning as though success were nothing more than mathematics. People admired him because he seemed impossible to intimidate. They rarely noticed the habit that followed him into every room. Ethan enjoyed testing people. He enjoyed discovering invisible hierarchies and reminding everyone exactly where they belonged within them. Tonight's private dinner mattered more than most. Across the long walnut table sat executives from a European technology company considering a partnership worth nearly $800 million. Every smile carried strategic value. Every handshake could move markets. Every word mattered. Yet Ethan seemed more entertained by the woman refilling water glasses than by the negotiation itself. Leaning slightly toward one of his associates, he spoke another sentence in Russian, slower this time, almost inviting anyone nearby to understand. Laughter rippled from his side of the table, not loud enough to interrupt dinner, just loud enough to leave a sting hidden beneath polished manners. Naomi continued serving without the smallest change in expression. She acknowledged another guest with a courteous smile, adjusted a linen napkin that had slipped half an inch from perfect alignment, then stepped gracefully toward the next table. If the words reached her, nothing about her face admitted it. That silence amused Ethan even more. He mistook composure for ignorance, just as powerful people sometimes mistake quietness for weakness. Across the room, a silver-haired gentleman visiting from Moscow paused while raising his wine glass. His eyes followed Naomi for only a second before drifting back toward Ethan. He said nothing. Another guest glanced between them with the faintest hint of curiosity before returning to the conversation about artificial intelligence and international markets. The restaurant remained wrapped in elegance, but something subtle had shifted beneath the polished surface. It was almost impossible to notice unless someone knew exactly where to look. Naomi placed a bottle of imported mineral water onto a service tray, straightened its label until it faced outward with perfect symmetry, and continued walking with calm, measured steps that never hurried and never hesitated. Her breathing stayed even. Her shoulders never tightened. Her attention never wandered from her work. Yet somewhere behind those composed brown eyes, a quiet calculation had already begun. Ethan believed he was performing for an audience that could not understand him. He believed language itself had become another symbol of status, another expensive accessory proving his superiority. Around him, expensive watches reflected candlelight. Conversations floated between billion-dollar valuations and luxury vacations. The pianist eased into another melody while servers glided silently across polished marble floors. Everything looked exactly as it should. Everything sounded exactly as it should. And almost no one realized that the most important conversation of the evening had already begun long before anyone heard the first response. Naomi crossed the dining room with the same calm rhythm she had practiced through thousands of evening shifts, balancing a polished silver tray as effortlessly as if it weighed nothing at all. The Marlowe house demanded perfection from every member of its staff. A glass placed an inch too far from the edge of the table could earn a warning. A delayed refill could cost a generous tip. Every movement was expected to disappear into the experience the guests believed they had purchased. Naomi understood that invisible excellence was the highest standard in fine dining, and she had mastered it long ago. She greeted each table with the same warm professionalism, offering fresh, sparkling water, replacing folded linen napkins, and quietly answering questions about the evening's tasting menu without ever interrupting a conversation. To the guests, she was another face wearing the restaurant's signature black uniform. To the staff, she was the server everyone trusted during high-profile events because she never lost her composure. The dinner that evening had drawn some of the most influential people in finance, technology, and international business. Every seat around Ethan Caldwell's private table represented decades of experience, billions of dollars in investments, and reputations carefully built across boardrooms around the world. Their conversations floated between market expansion, artificial intelligence, and global partnerships, yet every few minutes Ethan steered the attention somewhere else. His confidence filled the room as naturally as the music drifting from the piano in the corner. People laughed when he laughed. They nodded when he spoke. Success had taught him that influence often sounded louder than truth. As another course arrived, Ethan casually glanced toward Naomi again. She was describing a seasonal seafood entree to an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary, her voice calm, respectful, and unhurried. She listened before answering questions, something Ethan rarely bothered to do in business meetings. Watching her, he smirked to himself before quietly speaking another sentence in Russian to the executive seated beside him. The man chuckled into his wine glass, shaking his head with amused disbelief. Across the table, a younger investor frowned for a brief moment. He did not understand every word, but he recognized enough to know the remarks were not compliments. He looked toward Naomi, expecting some visible reaction. There was none. She thanked the couple, wished them an enjoyable evening, and continued toward another table without the slightest hesitation. Ethan interpreted her silence exactly the way he wanted. He leaned back comfortably, convinced his private comments remained safely hidden behind a language barrier. It was a familiar game to him, one he had played during overseas conferences and exclusive dinners for years. Foreign languages, in his mind, were useful not only for negotiation but also for creating invisible walls between those with power and those expected merely to serve. Near the entrance, General Manager Michael Donovan quietly observed the room from behind the reception podium. He knew Ethan's reputation well enough to recognize the subtle shifts in atmosphere whenever the billionaire attended an event. Conversations became more cautious. Employees moved with greater precision. Guests paid closer attention. Michael had learned that powerful clients often expected special treatment, and tonight's dinner carried too much financial importance for even the smallest disruption. He noticed Ethan's table laughing more frequently than everyone else, but assumed the evening was progressing successfully. Meanwhile, the distinguished gentleman from Moscow continued watching the exchange with growing curiosity. He noticed details most people overlooked. The precise way Naomi pronounced the names of imported mineral waters. The effortless confidence with which she arranged a bottle of premium Russian vodka according to traditional etiquette before presenting it unopened for inspection. Tiny gestures, nearly invisible, yet impossible for someone familiar with Russian customs to ignore. He raised an eyebrow but remained silent, allowing the evening to unfold naturally. Naomi returned to the service station, checked the next sequence of courses, and accepted another tray from the kitchen. The stainless steel doors swung open behind her as chefs called quiet instructions over the steady rhythm of sizzling pans and plated desserts. Outside the kitchen, elegance never cracked. Inside, every second counted. Naomi inhaled slowly before stepping back into the dining room. She carried herself exactly as she had when her shift began, composed, attentive, and completely professional. But while the guests believed the evening belonged to billionaires, investors, and executives negotiating fortunes across candlelit tables, another story was quietly gathering momentum beneath the surface. waiting for the exact moment when a single sentence would change who truly commanded the room. The first hint that something unusual was unfolding arrived so quietly that almost everyone missed it. Ethan accepted another glass of imported mineral water without looking at the person serving him, his attention fixed instead on the conversation surrounding projected returns and international acquisitions. He thanked no one. He rarely did. Gratitude, in his view, belonged to people asking for favors, not to those providing a service. Naomi simply nodded and continued around the table with the same measured confidence that had carried her through every demanding shift since joining the Marlowe house 3 years earlier. She never rushed because rushing invited mistakes, and mistakes had never been an option for someone who had learned that she would often be judged more harshly than others doing the exact same job. Long before she memorized the restaurant's wine list or perfected the choreography of fine dining, Naomi Brooks had discovered another language entirely. Growing up in Baltimore, she spent countless afternoons inside a modest public library while her mother worked double shifts as a registered nurse. Most children wandered toward adventure novels or comic books. Naomi wandered toward languages. Spanish first, then French. Later, almost by accident, she found an old Russian grammar textbook donated decades earlier. The alphabet fascinated her because it looked like a secret code waiting to be unlocked. What began as curiosity slowly became discipline. She copied unfamiliar letters into worn notebooks until they became natural. She borrowed pronunciation recordings from the library and repeated every sentence aloud while walking home. Years later, a scholarship carried her to Georgetown University, where she chose to study linguistics instead of pursuing something more practical. Friends questioned the decision. Professors warned her that languages rarely made people wealthy. Naomi smiled politely and continued studying anyway, because she believed knowledge was valuable even when no one else could immediately measure its worth. During her junior year, she spent 1 semester abroad in Eastern Europe through an academic exchange program, living with a host family that insisted everyone speak only Russian during meals. At first, she struggled through awkward conversations and embarrassing mistakes. By the end of the program, she debated literature, discussed history, and laughed at jokes that could never survive translation into English. When graduation arrived, she spoke several languages with remarkable fluency, yet life ignored impressive resumes as often as it rewarded them. Her father became seriously ill only months after commencement, forcing Naomi to postpone graduate school and return to New York, where stable income mattered more than academic ambitions. Waiting tables paid the bills, covered medical expenses, and gave her flexibility that office jobs could not. She promised herself it would be temporary. Life quietly extended that promise 1 year at a time. Yet she refused to see the uniform as defeat. Every shift became another opportunity to observe people, sharpen patience, and remember that dignity came from character rather than job titles. Those lessons stayed with her through difficult customers, exhausting weekends, and long nights that stretched well beyond midnight. None of the guests surrounding Ethan Caldwell knew any of that. They saw polished black shoes, a pressed uniform, and a welcoming smile. They never imagined the woman refilling their glasses could comfortably discuss Russian poetry, explain linguistic history, or translate complex conversations without hesitation. Naomi had stopped expecting strangers to recognize hidden strengths long ago. She found freedom in letting people underestimate her, because assumptions often revealed more about the observer than the person being observed. Across the private dining room, the distinguished visitor from Moscow watched her once again as she effortlessly pronounced the name of a rare mineral water sourced near the Caucasus Mountains with flawless accent placement. His curiosity deepened. Beside him, another executive continued laughing at Ethan's latest comment without realizing it carried a second meaning concealed inside another language. Naomi collected an empty appetizer plate, thanked a guest who held out his chair to make room for her, and moved gracefully toward the kitchen doors. Her expression remained calm, almost serene, but her memory preserved every Russian sentence Ethan had spoken since the evening began. She understood every insult, every joke, every careless assumption. She simply chose not to answer yet because timing, like language itself, was powerful only when used with purpose. The next course arrived beneath polished silver covers, releasing the rich aroma of roasted herbs and slow-cooked beef as servers moved through the dining room with synchronized precision. Conversations resumed as though nothing unusual had happened, yet an invisible current continued flowing beneath every exchange at Ethan Caldwell's table. He welcomed attention the way some people welcomed sunlight. Every story became larger when he told it. Every accomplishment sounded inevitable. The guests admired his confidence because they had spent years reading headlines, celebrating his success, but few understood how completely that success had shaped the way he viewed the people around him. Ethan had grown up believing excellence demanded relentless competition. His father, a successful corporate attorney, measured nearly every conversation in terms of achievement. Winning scholarships mattered. Graduating first mattered. Closing deals mattered. Anything less quietly disappeared from memory. By the time Ethan launched his first investment company in his late 20s, he had developed a remarkable ability to read financial markets, negotiate under pressure, and recognize opportunities before competitors noticed them. Those talents transformed a modest startup into Caldwell Capital, a firm managing billions of dollars across international markets. Investors admired his discipline because it produced extraordinary returns. Employees respected his intelligence because he could solve complicated problems with astonishing speed. Yet success also nurtured another habit that rarely appeared in magazine interviews. Ethan gradually divided the world into visible and invisible people. Visible people influenced outcomes. Invisible people served the environment in which important conversations happened. Hotel staff, drivers, receptionists, waiters, flight attendants. They existed inside his daily routine without ever becoming part of his attention unless something went wrong. It was never loud arrogance. It was something quieter and, in many ways, more dangerous. It was the certainty that status accurately measured human value. Tonight, surrounded by investors and executives, that certainty felt stronger than ever. Every person at the table wanted something from the evening. A partnership, a signature, a future opportunity. Ethan sensed their admiration and unconsciously allowed it to reinforce the story he already believed about himself. He spoke confidently about emerging markets, quoted international economic reports from memory, and effortlessly shifted between English and Russian whenever he wished to impress the visiting delegation. Several guests complimented his language skills, and he accepted their praise with the relaxed smile of someone who expected it. When another bottle of premium sparkling water appeared beside his glass, he barely glanced upward before speaking another sentence in Russian, this time with an amused laugh that encouraged the executives beside him to join in. The remark carried a dismissive joke about people who spent their lives serving others instead of leading them. Two guests laughed immediately. One forced a smile without understanding the language. Across the table, the distinguished visitor from Moscow remained completely silent. His eyes drifted toward Naomi for only a moment before returning to Ethan. The contrast between them had become impossible for him to ignore. One person seemed determined to demonstrate superiority. The other seemed completely uninterested in defending herself. Naomi carefully placed fresh bread beside each guest with the same steady hands that had never once betrayed irritation. She thanked an elderly investor who moved his coffee cup to make space for her tray. She smiled warmly at a guest who asked for another slice of lemon. Her professionalism never changed, no matter who occupied the chair before her. The rhythm of service continued with graceful precision while candlelight shimmered across crystal glasses and polished silverware reflected the warm glow hanging above the dining room. To everyone watching casually, it appeared to be another flawless evening inside one of Manhattan's finest restaurants. Yet beneath that polished elegance, assumptions continued stacking one upon another like fragile glass balanced at the edge of a table. Ethan believed every Russian sentence disappeared into the air unheard. Naomi understood every syllable without revealing a single reaction. The visitor from Moscow quietly noticed details neither of them realized he had observed. Around them, conversations about investments and global expansion continued without interruption, unaware that the evening's most valuable lesson would soon have nothing to do with money, markets, or influence, but with the extraordinary difference between speaking another language and truly understanding another human being. The dessert menus had not yet reached the table, but the evening had already settled into the comfortable rhythm that accompanies people convinced they control every variable around them. Candlelight shimmered across polished crystal, quiet laughter blended with the mellow piano, and conversations drifted effortlessly between investment strategies and international expansion. Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the night was unfolding exactly according to plan. The executives around him listened closely whenever he spoke, eager to catch every observation that might reveal his thinking. He enjoyed that attention, and without realizing it, he began performing for it. As Naomi approached to clear another course, Ethan looked briefly toward one of his associates and spoke once again in Russian. This time his words carried more confidence than caution. He joked that some people mastered the art of carrying plates because they lacked the ability to carry responsibility. A few guests laughed politely, assuming they had been invited into a harmless private joke. Another executive who understood only fragments of Russian smiled uncertainly, sensing that the humor came at someone else's expense. Naomi collected empty dishes with the same calm precision she had shown all evening. She thanked one guest for moving his chair, balanced 3 porcelain plates on her tray with effortless control, and quietly wished another couple an enjoyable meal as she passed their table. Her face revealed nothing. Her breathing remained even. Not once did she glance toward Ethan with irritation or embarrassment. That silence encouraged him. He mistook restraint for ignorance, believing every unanswered remark gave him permission to continue. The billionaire had spent years operating in environments where few people challenged him directly. Success had created an invisible shield around his behavior. Employees rarely disagreed. Investors hesitated to question him. Hotel managers accommodated him. Restaurant owners welcomed him. Every experience quietly reinforced the belief that confidence and correctness were the same thing. Across the table, however, the distinguished visitor from Moscow had stopped participating in the business discussion altogether. Instead, he watched Naomi with thoughtful curiosity. Earlier, he had noticed her flawless pronunciation of Russian product names. Now he noticed something even more revealing. As Ethan spoke, Naomi instinctively paused for the briefest fraction of a second before continuing her work, almost as though every Russian sentence registered naturally before she deliberately chose to move on. The pause lasted no longer than a heartbeat, but for someone fluent in the language, it was unmistakable. He lowered his wine glass without saying a word. Nearby, another server quietly asked Naomi whether table 12 needed additional coffee service. She answered warmly, coordinated the timing with the kitchen, and continued working without missing a step. Her professionalism never wavered. Every guest received the same respectful attention regardless of appearance, occupation, or influence. She treated the young couple celebrating an engagement with the same care she gave the billionaires discussing international acquisitions. That consistency came from years of believing that dignity should never depend on the person standing in front of you. Ethan noticed none of it. He had become increasingly entertained by his own private commentary, occasionally slipping another Russian observation into the conversation whenever Naomi approached. One remark suggested that expensive restaurants had become excellent places to hide unrealized ambitions. Another implied that some dreams ended behind serving trays instead of office desks. Each comment drew another quiet laugh from those eager to remain in his good graces. Yet not everyone joined in anymore. A younger investor shifted uncomfortably in his chair, sensing that the atmosphere had changed. Even without understanding every word, he recognized the growing imbalance between one person's confidence and another person's quiet restraint. General Manager Michael Donovan glanced toward the private dining room once more. Everything appeared orderly from a distance. Guests remained seated. Service flowed smoothly. No voices were raised. Still, years of experience had taught him that elegant rooms could conceal uncomfortable moments beneath polished manners. He made a mental note to check on the table after the next course. Meanwhile, Naomi returned from the kitchen carrying a silver tray with freshly brewed coffee, specialty teas, and handcrafted desserts arranged with meticulous care. The aroma of warm chocolate and roasted espresso drifted gently through the room as she approached Ethan's table once again. She already knew every word he had spoken throughout the evening. She remembered each sentence with perfect clarity. She also knew something no one else at the table could possibly imagine. The moment for silence was ending, and the moment for truth was only one conversation away. Naomi arrived beside the table carrying a polished silver tray that held freshly brewed coffee, porcelain cups, and a dessert sampler prepared with almost mathematical precision. The rich aroma of roasted espresso mingled with warm vanilla and dark chocolate, briefly softening the atmosphere that had quietly grown heavier over the past hour. Ethan Caldwell accepted his coffee without looking up, still immersed in a conversation about international expansion. Then, with the casual confidence that had followed him all evening, he leaned slightly toward the executive seated beside him and spoke another sentence in Russian. This time his voice was just loud enough for several nearby guests to hear the unfamiliar language, though not its meaning. He smiled as he remarked that some people became so comfortable serving successful individuals that they probably forgot they were capable of anything else. A few restrained laughs circled the table. One executive lowered his eyes into his coffee. The distinguished visitor from Moscow remained perfectly still. Naomi carefully placed the final dessert plate before Ethan, adjusted the handle of his coffee cup so it faced comfortably toward his right hand, and for the first time that evening, she did not step away. A silence, gentle but unmistakable, settled over the table. Ethan noticed her standing there and finally looked directly at her. His expression carried polite impatience, the kind reserved for interruptions he believed should not exist. Naomi met his eyes with complete composure. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, respectful, and remarkably steady. She answered him in flawless Russian. Every consonant landed naturally. Every vowel carried the effortless rhythm of someone who had spent years speaking the language rather than memorizing it. The sentence was neither emotional nor confrontational. She simply said that true success was measured by the respect a person showed when they believed no one else could understand them. The words floated across the candlelit room with quiet clarity. For one suspended moment, nothing moved. The laughter disappeared. Several guests looked from Naomi to Ethan, unsure whether they had heard correctly. The executive beside Ethan slowly lowered his coffee cup before it reached his lips. Across the room, even the soft piano seemed to fade beneath the unexpected stillness. Ethan blinked once, surprised enough that he forgot to answer. Naomi continued speaking in Russian with the same measured confidence. She politely explained that she had understood every comment made throughout the evening. She thanked him for giving her an unexpected opportunity to practice a language she had studied for many years. Then, with remarkable courtesy, she added one final observation. She gently pointed out that in one of his earlier remarks, he had misused a common Russian expression, changing its intended meaning entirely. Her correction was precise, respectful, and unmistakably accurate. There was no trace of mockery in her voice. She did not raise her tone. She did not attempt to embarrass him. She simply stated the correct expression as naturally as a teacher helping a student avoid a mistake. The distinguished visitor from Moscow closed his eyes briefly before an unmistakable smile crossed his face. He knew instantly that her correction was completely accurate. Several guests who understood Russian exchanged astonished glances, realizing that the conversation they had assumed belonged exclusively to Ethan had never been private at all. Naomi offered Ethan the same professional smile she had given every guest that evening. Then, she quietly wished everyone an enjoyable dessert service, lifted her now empty tray with graceful confidence, and turned to continue her work as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Behind her, the dining room remained perfectly silent, because every person at the table suddenly understood that the balance of the evening had shifted forever, not through anger or humiliation, but through quiet dignity, extraordinary restraint, and a truth spoken only when the moment was finally worthy of it. For several long seconds, the only sound inside the private dining room was the faint melody drifting from the piano and the quiet hum of the city beyond the tall windows overlooking Manhattan. Every conversation had stopped. Every fork remained suspended above untouched dessert plates. Ethan Caldwell stared across the table, searching Naomi's face for the slightest hint that she had rehearsed the moment or planned some elaborate attempt to embarrass him. Instead, he found only the same composed professionalism she had shown since the beginning of the evening. She had not raised her voice. She had not challenged him. She had simply answered with honesty and grace. Before Ethan could gather his thoughts, The distinguished visitor from Moscow slowly placed his coffee cup onto its saucer and rose from his chair. His movement immediately drew every eye in the room. He offered Naomi a respectful nod before speaking in Russian with the calm confidence of a native speaker. His words carried warmth rather than surprise, thanking her for preserving both the beauty of the language and the dignity of the conversation. Naomi answered naturally, matching his pace and pronunciation so effortlessly that their exchange sounded less like strangers speaking and more like longtime colleagues meeting again after many years. Several guests who understood Russian looked at one another with unmistakable astonishment. The conversation flowed with subtle expressions, cultural references, and idioms that only fluent speakers would comfortably use. It was impossible to dismiss her knowledge as memorized phrases or fortunate preparation. She belonged inside the language as completely as anyone. At the table, the gentleman smiled before turning toward Ethan. Switching back to English so everyone could understand, he spoke with remarkable courtesy. Your waitress did not merely understand your words. She understood your intentions. There is an important difference. His voice remained calm, yet every sentence seemed to settle heavily across the room. He continued by explaining that Naomi's correction earlier had been entirely accurate. In fact, the expression Ethan had confidently used several times during the evening was one that educated Russian speakers rarely misused because its meaning changed dramatically when spoken the way Ethan had pronounced it. A few quiet smiles appeared around the table. They were not expressions of mockery. They were the natural reaction of people realizing that confidence alone could not replace genuine understanding. Ethan felt the attention of every guest resting upon him. For perhaps the first time in years, he had no prepared response. Across countless negotiations, he had always found the right words. Tonight they refused to come. Naomi remained standing beside the service station only long enough to ensure every guest had everything they needed before politely excusing herself to assist another table. She neither lingered to enjoy the silence nor looked back to measure its effect. Her focus returned immediately to the responsibilities she had carried all evening. That quiet decision impressed the room almost as much as her flawless Russian. She had been given an opportunity to celebrate a personal victory, yet she chose professionalism instead. General Manager Michael Donovan had witnessed enough of the exchange to understand that something extraordinary had occurred. As he watched Naomi continue serving another family with the same welcoming smile and careful attention, he realized nothing about her attitude had changed. The only thing that had changed was the way everyone else now saw her. Around Ethan's table, the discussion about business partnerships no longer held the same energy. Executives who had laughed earlier now reflected quietly on the evening's unexpected lesson. The polished walls, crystal chandeliers, and expensive artwork surrounding them suddenly felt less impressive than the simple dignity displayed by the woman they had almost overlooked. In a room filled with wealth, influence, and carefully cultivated reputations, respect had quietly become the most valuable thing anyone possessed, and everyone present understood that it could never be purchased, only earned. The evening never truly returned to the effortless rhythm it had carried before. Conversations resumed, but they did so more carefully, as though every guest had suddenly become aware that words possessed a weight beyond the language in which they were spoken. Ethan Caldwell remained seated with his untouched coffee growing cold beside him. The confidence that had guided every discussion earlier now gave way to thoughtful silence. Across the table, the executives who had laughed at his private remarks no longer seemed eager to meet his eyes. They focused instead on dessert plates, coffee cups, or the skyline shimmering beyond the windows. No one openly criticized him. No one needed to. The absence of laughter spoke more clearly than any accusation ever could. The distinguished visitor from Moscow returned to his seat with the quiet composure of someone who had simply acknowledged an obvious truth. He resumed discussing the proposed partnership, yet the tone of the meeting had changed. Instead of following Ethan's lead without question, the conversation became more balanced. Other executives contributed ideas with greater confidence, and thoughtful debate replaced effortless agreement. It was a subtle shift, but an unmistakable one. Influence had not disappeared from the room. It had simply become something that now needed to be earned again. Meanwhile, Naomi continued serving guests throughout the restaurant exactly as she had before. She refreshed coffee cups, answered questions about the dessert selection, and congratulated the elderly couple celebrating their anniversary with the same sincere warmth that had defined every interaction that evening. Not once did she mention what had happened. Not once did she glance toward Ethan expecting an apology or acknowledgement. Her attention remained on the work in front of her because she understood something that many people spent a lifetime learning. Character did not become stronger after recognition. It revealed itself long before recognition arrived. General Manager Michael Donovan quietly approached Naomi near the service station while another server delivered fresh espresso to a nearby table. He spoke softly, asking whether everything was all right. Naomi answered with a gentle smile that the evening was proceeding smoothly and that every guest had been taken care of. Michael looked at her for a moment before simply nodding with genuine respect. He had managed luxury restaurants for more than 2 decades and had witnessed countless difficult interactions between influential customers and hardworking employees. Rarely had he seen someone respond with such remarkable patience, confidence, and restraint. Back inside the private dining room, Ethan slowly lifted his coffee cup before setting it down again without taking a sip. He replayed every Russian sentence he had spoken since arriving at the restaurant. They had sounded clever when he first said them. Now they sounded remarkably small. For years he had believed that intelligence meant staying one step ahead of everyone else. Tonight he had discovered that wisdom required something entirely different. It required recognizing the humanity of people long before they had an opportunity to prove themselves. Around the table, business discussions gradually concluded, and the executives began preparing to leave. Handshakes were exchanged. Business cards disappeared into tailored suit pockets. Chairs slid quietly across polished hardwood floors. Yet even as contracts and future meetings were discussed, another memory continued lingering in every mind. It was not the projected investment figures or the international expansion strategy that people would remember from this dinner. They would remember the quiet waitress who answered disrespect with dignity, knowledge, and grace. As guests rose from their seats, several offered Naomi warm smiles and sincere thanks that carried noticeably more respect than earlier in the evening. She responded to each one with the same courteous professionalism she had shown from the beginning, treating every person equally without holding on to resentment or seeking recognition. The room itself had not changed. The chandeliers still glowed warmly above polished tables. Soft jazz still drifted through the restaurant. Manhattan still sparkled beyond the windows. Yet everyone leaving that evening carried a different understanding of what true stature looked like, and it had nothing to do with the balance of a bank account or the title printed on a business card. The last guests slowly gathered their coats as the evening settled into the peaceful rhythm that always followed a successful dinner service. Outside, Manhattan glowed beneath thousands of city lights, each window reflecting another story unfolding somewhere above the streets. Inside the Marlowe house, servers quietly reset tables for the following day, folding crisp linen, polishing silverware, and replacing fresh flowers with the same careful attention that had defined the entire evening. Naomi Brooks carried an empty tray back toward the service station, her pace steady, her expression calm, as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. She had never come to work hoping to teach anyone a lesson. She had only come prepared to do her job with excellence, just as she had every day before. As Ethan Caldwell prepared to leave, he paused beside the table where the evening had changed direction. The conversations about investments and expansion had ended. The contracts would continue through lawyers and boardrooms in the weeks ahead. Yet the numbers no longer occupied his thoughts. Instead, he found himself remembering the effortless confidence with which Naomi had spoken, not to defeat him, but simply to answer truthfully. He realized that throughout his career he had measured intelligence by achievements, influence, and financial success. Tonight, someone wearing a server's uniform had quietly revealed a kind of wisdom he had never learned inside any executive office. Ethan looked across the dining room and noticed Naomi helping a young coworker arrange dessert forks before tomorrow's reservations. She explained a small detail about table placement with patience and encouragement, never mentioning the remarkable moment everyone else would remember for years. There was no celebration, no demand for recognition, no attempt to prolong the attention that had briefly settled upon her. She simply continued serving others with the same dignity she had carried before anyone knew what she was capable of. That consistency affected Ethan more deeply than any public criticism ever could. After a long moment, he walked toward the service station. Several nearby employees glanced up, uncertain what might happen next, but the restaurant remained quiet. Ethan waited until Naomi finished assisting her coworker before speaking. His voice was noticeably softer than it had been earlier that evening. He thanked her for the exceptional service she had provided and acknowledged that he had allowed confidence to become something far less admirable. He admitted that he had spoken carelessly because he assumed no one around him would understand, and he recognized that assumption had revealed more about his own character than about anyone else's. Naomi listened without interrupting. When he finished, she offered a warm, sincere smile that carried neither triumph nor resentment. She simply told him that languages opened doors between people only when respect walked through first. Knowledge, she said, was meaningful, but kindness determined how that knowledge would be remembered. Ethan nodded quietly. There was nothing to argue with because every word rang true. Before leaving, the distinguished visitor from Moscow passed both of them near the entrance. He smiled warmly and said, "Fluency may impress a room, but character earns its respect." Neither Ethan nor Naomi answered immediately because the sentence required no response. It simply settled into the evening like the final note of a beautiful piece of music. A few minutes later, the restaurant doors closed behind the last guest, and the city continued moving as though nothing remarkable had happened. Yet for everyone who had witnessed that dinner, something had changed. They had arrived expecting to remember a billionaire discussing business. Instead, they left remembering a quiet waitress whose knowledge never demanded attention, whose confidence never sought applause, and whose dignity remained unchanged whether others recognized it or not. Wealth could command a reservation at the finest table in the city. Influence could shape conversations inside powerful boardrooms. But neither could replace the simple grace of treating another person with respect before discovering who they truly were. Because in the end, the strongest voice in the room was never the loudest one. It was the one that spoke with humility, truth, and unwavering respect for the humanity shared by everyone, regardless of the title they carried or the uniform they wore.